Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you a review of what has become very quickly a very indispensable part of my own personal workflow, and that is this new BenQ SW271 4K, and this is specifically a photo editing monitor. This is a monitor made for photographers, and while it's not inexpensive, it has been pretty revolutionary in doing what I do. And so I'm here today to give you a review of some of the features and maybe a little bit of information on how to maximize the most out if you purchase an SW271 for yourself. And so for years prior to this, I had been working with this Dell U2410 monitor, which in a lot of ways has been a good monitor. In fact, I've always thought of it as being a very good monitor. It comes with hardware calibration or factory calibration, and so color accuracy is quite good on it. Of course, you can always do hardware calibration as well with some kind of external device. And so that's been kind of my go-to display. However, since I switched to doing 4K editing and of course also dealing with increasingly higher resolution camera bodies, I realized that I needed to move to a larger and higher definition display. So I began the search for what would be kind of my next monitor, and anyway, this is what I have come upon, this BenQ SW271, which is a 4K screen, and obviously you might be able to tell from the model number. This is a 27-inch. You can get larger than that, and in some cases you might prefer larger, but of course, understand, as always, that the bigger you go, the more that you're going to pay for it as well. So anyway, this has a 4K 3840 by 2160 pixel resolution. And so just note that if you're switching, as I did, the U2410 is a 1920 by 1200. So, not quite 16:9. This is actually a 16:9 display ratio. This was a little bit different than a 16:9 ratio, but obviously, basically for practical purposes, right around, 1080 or full HD in terms of resolution. So know that if you move to a 4K display, number one, you are going to have to figure out what is going to be the optimal setting for you for resizing things. There are some apps and programs that are very intuitive about that process, others that are less so. And some of it's ironic. For example, Adobe Photoshop, it has no problem with the resizing for this kind of display, yet with Lightroom I found that a lot of things just didn't work for me. I needed a little bit a lot of this kind of thing along the sides was way too small. And so anyway, you're going to have to play with some settings. For example, this is a Windows PC that I use, and so in Windows 10, you can actually can resize things. I think I actually ended up going with a little bit higher than the 150% magnification on a lot of things. Maybe around 170% is where I ended up. But just note that in your preferences, your settings here for this, that what I actually ended up doing is I changed on the panels, I changed the font size to larger, which in this case is 200%. Before everything was really, really tiny. And so this has enabled things to kind of recalibrate to a place that looks really good for me. But at the same time, of course, I'm enjoying having much higher resolution on everything. And so now, before I go into the many, many positives here, I'm first going to delineate the one thing that I do consider to be a negative in terms of the ergonomics for the SW271. And that is that while it does have a card reader, and the card reader has very high transfer rates. It operates, basically like a USB 3.0 card reader would. And so I am utilizing it for importing photos off of a 5D Mark IV or a Sony A7 Mark III or A6500, whatever. And so it works quickly. But the nature of it is because the bezel of the actual monitor is quite slim, it's recessed a little bit. And so as you can see, it's basically about the length of my fingers here that it's recessed in from the bezel. Byproduct of that is that it can be a little bit finicky trying to get a card in and out of there, and also it's, there's not a whole lot of depth to work with, and so your fingers are working fairly close to the back of the monitor in a recessed position. And so the ergonomics of accessing the card reader, even though the card reader itself is fantastic, the ergonomics of accessing that card reader are less fantastic. And so anyway, just be aware of that. And that applies also on the side here. There are two USB 3.0 open ports that you can use for attaching things. I have a secondary card reader attached there, for example, for like CF cards. You're only going to be able to use SD sized cards in the built-in card reader. And so, I have used monitors before that had more free USB ports than that. In this case, you've only got 2 that are available to you, but at the same time, everything works there. It's just ergonomically, it's not fantastic. Fortunately, everything else about the ergonomics is fantastic. The actual stand itself, it moves very nice and easily, gives you a lot of versatility in moving it up and down. You have some tilt. Up and down, of course, you could rotate into a portrait orientation if you were so inclined, or maybe if you were running a couple of them like this. I'm just utilizing the U2410 for now in that kind of secondary position, although a second one of these babies would be fantastic. But what is really, really fantastic about this as a photographer, remember this is designed for photographers, and so it's got some things that are incredibly important for photographers. Number one of the first things you're going to see when you open up the box, and everything here is beautifully packed and packaged here. You can really tell that this is a premium product, and it is presented as such as you start to unpack it. One of the first things I saw was the online factory calibration report. I've seen before some monitors, I believe the U2410 was one of those, they claim in the marketing information that it is, factory calibrated. Well, in this case, I actually got a calibration report with the serial number of this particular monitor and all of these different things that were broken down. Color gamut, DICOM, E-measurement, color gamma, a DICOM curve, all of these things were all detailed with the actual values on there. And so you know that the calibration has actually been done. And so the actual color space itself, it will allow you to, it has 99% of Adobe RGB coverage, which of course is very, very high. It's Technicolor certified. It's got all of those type things. Obviously, it's an IPS panel, a premium type panel. One of the things that's really cool about this is that it comes with what they call, I think they call it a hotkey puck or something. And there's a space right here at the monitor base that can kind of pop into. But the really cool thing is that you can directly move in between things like, for example, my natural color space is Adobe RGB. That's what I'm working in. But at the press of a button, I can switch over to sRGB. So if I am, for example, looking at Windows Photo Viewer, which unfortunately does not support Adobe RGB space, so I can switch to sRGB and I can, see photos as they're supposed to be seen. It also has different black and white modes you can switch into if you're wanting to actually look at photos in black and white, maybe as a reference point before you start to edit. You have that option of going there. And then of course, it actually has kind of redundant controls. You've got, typical menu type controls here along the bottom, but you can also use this hotkey along with the center navigating wheel to actually access the, the different kind of modes you're entering in. And so here I've got color mode options. If I've run calibrations, for example, I can choose different calibrations because obviously you can calibrate for different workspaces that you're trying to do. And so you can access those, and change all of those settings there. In fact, if you want to run a couple of ports into the monitor itself, or if by ports, maybe you want a couple of cables from your source, your video card or whatever, into it. And of course, you've got all of the typical options, display port, you've got USB-C options coming into it, you have got Thunderbolt, all of those different kind of options, along with things like HDMI, obviously. But if you want to run a couple of inputs into it, what you can actually do is run a simultaneous simultaneous side by side. That they call that gamut duo, and so you can run two different gamuts there side by side. Color rendition on this, it certainly lives up to the billing. It is just fantastic. And you know, I thought I was getting good looking results on my older monitor, but when I switched to this, it was like my old monitor looked kind of muddy by comparison. I mean, all of that extra resolution, and then also the color accuracy, really inky black levels. I'm shocked even at looking at things like text. Obviously, what I do is I do a lot of writing and research as a part of writing reviews, and then of course as a minister and preparing sermons and studying. And so it's amazing to me how much more inky even text looks, and how much more, you know, kind of appropriate the white looks on the, even in working like Microsoft Word, for example. And what it felt like initially when I switched to this, it was like all of a sudden I had this massive, my iPad is an iPad Pro, and of course Apple's done a really good job with the display on this particular iPad. Color accuracy is very good. And so as a byproduct of that, it's like all of a sudden I had this massive iPad Pro screen, and so with that kind of black levels and that kind of color accuracy, so really fantastic. There's also a shading hood that comes that I'll demonstrate to you in just a moment with that you know, maybe depending on your workspace, if you've got a lot of spillover light and you want to focus in on that, it can be useful. I tried it for a while, and I find that due to the nature of my own workspace here, that I felt like a little bit of tunnel vision for me, and so I have, you know, kept it handy mostly for when I'm running calibration, and I'll note why that's helpful when I go into the calibration mode in just a second. And so anyway, all of these things in terms of working with it, so far it has worked flawlessly for me, and it's really brought a lot of joy into what is, you know, somewhat mundane work that I'm very accustomed to doing, because everything looks so much better. There's so much more detail, and it really makes me appreciate the differences even in the lenses that I'm reviewing. I'm able to see differences between them even more so, and knowing that I have an incredibly well calibrated color display also helps me to make my judgments that I do in image quality segments, for example, be able to do that with a lot of confidence. And so it's been great for that. So speaking about calibration, let's jump in for a second, and I'm going to just quickly show you how some of the calibration actually works. And of course, the advantage here is that it comes with access to the Palette Master software. Now that software, I don't know if it's as fully featured as, say, you know, the calibration software that comes with, you can get through the Spyder, for example. But the advantage here is that it's actually designed specifically for this display. And so what you're doing is you're actually calibrating the hardware of this display, as opposed to doing your calibration at the level of your video card, which means that if you're running multiple displays, for example, it's you know, less of an issue. You're actually you're calibrating for this color space right here. And so that's certainly very handy. So let's jump in, let's look at calibration here for a second. Okay, I'm actually in the process of running the calibration right now on the BenQ SW271. And of course, one of the advantages of this is that it comes with kind of a, not necessarily incorporated software. You do still need to download it onto your computer. However, it does kind of run, you know, it's designed specifically for use with these BenQ monitors. And so what you do need, however, is one of a number of different actual calibration devices. In this case, I'm using a Spyder5 Pro. And so once you've got it set up, and for this, it's, you know, it's probably wise to use, even if you're not going to use it on an ongoing basis, to use kind of the shading that comes with it. And what that's going to allow you to do is to just, number one, be able to more easily stabilize the cable for the calibration device. And so that you can rest it on there, you know, with a laptop screen, you can actually lay the screen, you know, basically flat. And so it's much easier to just kind of attach that, like the Spyder5 on there. But in this case, of course, you know, I have tilted the screen, which they recommend that you do, but there's a limit to how far that can be tilted. And so by using the actual shading device here, it enables me to then actually be able to suspend the Spyder5 in such a way to where it's staying in the kind of optimal position where the calibration software wants it to be. I will say that in my opinion, having had a lot of experience with color over the years, obviously in what I do, I did feel like, number one, I mean, there was a report that came from the factory as to the calibration that was done and the result that they got. And so I felt like the calibration was actually really accurate to begin with. But of course, there are factors that come into play when it comes to calibration. For one thing, the environment in which you use the monitor, and so your ambient light can be a factor there. Another thing that can be a factor is the fact that you know, the behavior of monitors long term is not always permanent. There can be some variation, and so in fact, after using the monitor for several weeks, I started to get a notice just when it's powering up at the beginning, your monitor needs to be calibrated. Not because it wasn't calibrated to begin with, but just as a reminder that calibration can subtly shift over time. And so doing periodic calibration certainly is a wise thing, just to make sure that you're getting optimal performance out of your expensive, and in this case, fantastic monitor. Okay, and so as you can see, calibration is easy to do, and it takes a little bit of time, probably about, I think it took me about 15 minutes for it to run from start to finish. There's not a whole lot that you have to do other than having that set in place. But once the calibration is done, you can view the report, and so you can see the report that came up from this. You can run a validation, and so you put the actual you know, colorimeter back on there for a second, and it runs to verify the results. And that is much quicker process, under 2 minutes. And so it will come back and say, yes, you know, you passed it, the calibration is accurate. And so anyway, that certainly is a great asset to have that kind of built right into the design of the monitor itself. Though, of course, you do have to have a calibration device that you'll have to purchase separately, just to be aware of that. Now, one final thing that I want to cover before I cover price here at the end is that this is actually another accessory from BenQ that I've got added on here. And this is what they call the e-reading lamp, or the ScreenBar. And so it's kind of uniquely designed to go on the top of a monitor. It doesn't have to be even a BenQ monitor, but it's about providing illumination in your workspace. But it's designed quite cleverly in that the way that it sits on there, and it's kind of counterbalanced. There's a weight there at the back to make sure that it's going to sit in the right position. But it's designed in such a way that the distribution of light means that none of the light is actually hitting the screen itself. It skims right in front of the actual screen, so it's not messing with that, but then provides illumination on top of your workspace. Now, I actually have under cabinet lighting in here, but I found, like, for example, with my videos, that it's a bit of a problem, and that, as you can see right now, very annoyingly, the light is always cycling, and so it's just terrible for that. This obviously is a more constant light. You can actually enter a sensor mode. It will actually evaluate the light in your workspace, and it will set up the color balance, and then also it will set up the amount of illumination accordingly. You do have an option, of course, of just stepping that up or down in individual layers with a touch-sensitive button on the top. You can also actually do the same with the color balance. And so you can swing all the way from a very warm color balance to a very cool color balance, or somewhere in between. And so anyway, just a lot of versatility on that. And it runs very cleanly in terms of power. You can actually just power it from a USB port if you want to do that. In this case, you know, I've actually, because I set up this, I designed the workspace here in advance, I've actually got USB ports in the wall that I've actually plugged it into, and so it doesn't tie up something on my monitor. But of course, you can always just plug it right into your monitor there as well. And so particularly if you're working in a dark environment or kind of an unevenly lit environment, it can be a nice little bonus to help out with that. And so anyway, obviously, as you can tell, I'm really pleased with this display and how it's benefiting my workflow. And so I do want to get to the price here. This is not an inexpensive product. It's going to cost over $1,000, I think around $1,100 in the US market. Here in Canada, it's around $1,400 for it. And so as these monitors tend to be, it is expensive. However, if you are a photographer and you are looking for a display that is actually designed with photographers in mind, I know of few displays that are going to beat the BenQ SW271. It really is designed for photographers, and I can assure you that as a photographer, it works really well, and I'm extremely pleased with it. And so, I mean, I know that's a big chunk of money to spend, but if you're looking into getting serious into photography or video editing, and you need accuracy for your workflow, it's a chunk of money to spend, but I think that you're going to feel after you've done it that it is money well spent. For one thing, your images are going to shine like never before, and you can also know that when you are editing and you're making adjustments to your images, that you can be making them according to what is a standard that is going to be more consistent across other viewing devices, as opposed to a poorly calibrated device to where what looks fine there might look awful elsewhere. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, I'll throw some information there, some buying links if you'd like to buy one of these for yourself, and then also a link to the website if you'd like to do a little bit further research on the display itself. And of course, you can follow me there on social media. You can become one of my patrons, sign up for my newsletter, and if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.